One of the biggest changes that comes along with industrialization is mass urbanization. With the switch from subsistence farming to large scale industrial farming, this makes a lot of agricultural labor obsolete. And in order to find economic opportunities to support themselves, um, huge percentages of populations very rapidly move to large cities to find jobs in factories. And this explosive urbanization, for the most part, especially in the early years of industrialization in Great Britain, Western Europe, the United States, completely overwhelms these cities. Some cities double in size or more in every 15 to 20 years. And the biggest problem that comes along with that is that these cities are unable to manage the influx of population, and more importantly, their infrastructure is unable to keep up with the mass of people moving into these cities. So things like sewers, things like roads, housing, all of these things lag far, far behind, which leads to the construction of very poorly constructed housing tenements. um, Housing for the working classes is quickly and very shoddily just thrown up. Housing tenements are stacked on top of each other to conserve space, which makes for very, very harsh and cramped living conditions. Rooms are incredibly small, with oftentimes multiple families living in single rooms. There's a very high level of homelessness among the working class. Um, but beyond that, and probably the most dangerous part of this urbanization, is that the lack of the necessary infrastructure leads to absolutely horrific living conditions. In many of these working class neighborhoods, there are no facilities for waste or garbage removal, which means that every kind of possible refuse is thrown into the street. It's thrown into nearby water sources, the same water sources that people draw drinking water and bath water and cooking water from. The decaying food and the human waste attracts rats, insects, other scavengers. I mean, becomes a massive, massive health concern. All of these things attract flies, they attract mosquitoes, other disease bearing animals. Just I mean, general filth and just abject poverty. And one of the things that intensifies these really poor living conditions in urban areas is, as the conditions get worse, middle class families, the families who have the resources, begin to relocate to communities on the edge of the major cities known as suburbs. And this begins the process of what we call urban flight. And with these wealthier families moving out of these urbanized areas, it creates a situation where there's very little financial incentive and very little political incentive for governments and local governments and city governments to improve the working conditions in these urban areas. And it becomes a case of kind of out of sight, out of mind. The well-to-do, the wealthy, the lawmakers and politicians no longer live in these urban areas, so they're not exposed to the complete and utter poverty that the majority of the working class has to endure, right? So, I mean, you're talking about, housing tenements with, in some cases, 50 to 60 rooms being occupied by five, six, seven people per room. Sometimes two to three generations of entire families will live in a single, in a single apartment, or be spread across maybe two rooms. Large amounts of the population live in basements with no windows, no access to fresh air. generally very damp, very moldy, which again further intensifies the poor health among the working class as well. Not to mention the fact that again, waste just simply piles up wherever it lands. In some cases, cities are unable to clean streets or clean certain neighborhoods for months at a time, and the garbage and the animal waste and the human waste piles up, several feet high. And these are the conditions that many of the working class are just simply forced to accept because they don't have the resources or the opportunities to leave these areas or force local governments to make a change and fix these kinds of conditions. Now, because of this mass urbanization, right, there's also a pretty significant environmental effect. In order to provide living space for such a large urban population, millions of square miles of land is cleared. Um, Mining for coal and iron also causes mass deforestation. Agriculture is moved out away from cities because the waste and the chemical runoff from mining and the waste and the chemical runoff from industrial production essentially poisons the water table and ruins the soil. So families living in these urban areas don't have access even to the smallest bits of land where they could generate some kind of food source for themselves. All of the arable land is, taken advantage of outside of urban areas, and it's produced on large, generally industrial run, almost plantation style farms. Also, again, because of the nature of industrialization and the fact that we have to access new forms of fuel, coal burning machinery and coal burning factories cause large scale air pollution, coal dust and soot from fireplaces and from industrial furnaces circulate through the air in most urban centers. Lung and respiratory problems run rampant in most of these large cities. But by far the largest killer is contamination of water sources. Because there is not infrastructure in place in order to remove or effectively clean up the waste runoff of massive urbanization and massive industrialization, you have industrial waste, you have chemicals, you have dead animals, human and animal waste, garbage that is all basically just relegated to being dumped into lakes and rivers. And these lakes and these rivers also serve as the only source of drinking and and daily water for the majority of the working class population. So essentially, many of these working class families have no choice but to drink, to cook, and to wash with this highly contaminated water, which causes disease of all kinds like dysentery and cholera to run absolutely wild through lower working class neighborhoods. Right. So this is an image from Birmingham in England in the 19th century, and I mean you can see the the clear levels of air pollution that are being just simply dumped into these urban areas, and it's not like these factories are segregated from residential areas. I mean, you can see from the photo, these factories are in and among working class neighborhoods. So this smoke and this coal dust and these industrial byproducts are in the air, almost creating like a constant fog or a constant haze of dangerous chemicals in and around residential neighborhoods. On top of that, again, you have water pollution as well. Because of the lack of infrastructure, people are unable to get rid of their garbage, get rid of their human waste. Um, and so they do so in the most readily available methods, which is generally dumping into rivers and streams and lakes. You can see from this photo alone, the amount of garbage and the amount of waste that just simply piles up in and around the Ohio River, which is, for several major cities in the Midwest, the sole source of drinking water, in the United States.